Hello and welcome back to Take Back Your Authority with Heather Bulthuis. I'm excited to have you here. We are studying Esther Part 2. If you missed Part 1, go back and go ahead and look at that recording and you can find out all about Part 1 for Esther. So we are starting in Esther 5, Chapter 9. I'm sorry, Chapter 5, Verse 9. And here we go. Okay, so Haman's rage against Mordecai. Okay, verse 9. Haman went out that day, and so this just a little bit of a recap. So right before this, Esther had approached the king, and he said, "Yes, go ahead, come approach me." And he said, "I'll give you anything up to half the kingdom." And she requested that the king and Mordecai would come to a banquet. And so this is right after that. Okay, so Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai, always focusing on the negative. So he can't even be grateful that he was asked to the banquet by the queen to be with the king. He was just focusing on his hate and his rage for Mordecai. But nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. So calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him and how he had elevated him above all the other nobles and officials. So he was very prideful. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. So this is the second banquet that he's been invited to with the king. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Again, he's focusing on the negative. And so he's enraged because he's focusing on that rather than the positive that he was invited to the king's palace for a second banquet, just him and Esther. Be aware of what you focus on. So his wife, verse 14, his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Who wants friends like this? Have a pole set up, reaching to the height of 50 cubits, which is about 75 feet, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go to the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had a pole set up. Can you imagine? Like, oh yeah, why don't you just go kill that person? Oh yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Obviously, anyway, that just shows Haman's character. All right, chapter 6. That night, so Haman went home to his family. They talked about Mordecai and what was happening. They said, go build the gallows. And so that night, the king could not sleep because the noise of the gallows being made near him. So the king ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. He wanted to hear about his reign and how great he was and what he had done during his kingship. So it's kind of interesting. But so this is actually interesting because this is actually 5 years later. So these chronicles recorded, and then 5 years later, this is what the king is hearing. So it's important. Okay, so it was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. So again, this was 5 years ago that happened. And the king says, "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him the night before. So this must have been early the next day or midday or mid-morning. So his attendants answered, "Haman's standing in the court." "Bring him in," the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" Of course, because Haman is so prideful. So he answered the king. Now, there's also a parallel here. So last week I talked about when Mordecai had mentioned to the king about these people, he did not mention to him specifically that it was the Jewish people. And so it's very similar here where the king isn't specifically telling Haman, telling Haman who who he's meaning to be honored. Haman's just, assuming that it's going to be him. So, okay, so he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and his horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" Of course, Haman thinks it's going to be him, right? So, one thing too here is that when the royal robe is placed on somebody else, it actually also gives honor to the king. So, it's kind of a double honor to the person that's on the horse, but then it also is like, saying about the king, like how great the king is as well. Okay, so "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested to Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." So this must have made Haman's blood boil. Could just imagine that. And also, too, it's interesting that the king knows that Mordecai is a Jew, but at this point in time, he doesn't realize that Esther and Mordecai are related. Okay, so verse 11. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, I'm sure he was doing it begrudgingly, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." I can just imagine that would have been just so awful for him. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. He was mortified that he had to do that, and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is a Jew of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." So obviously Zeresh and the friends didn't know who that Mordecai was a Jew before this when they suggested to Mordecai to hang. I'm sorry, when they suggested to Haman to hang Mordecai, they obviously didn't realize that he was a Jew at that time. So now that they know that he's a Jew, they obviously have reverence for the God of the Jews, knowing that he is more powerful and that he could ruin people. So while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So that's typical that they would be escorted to the banquet. Okay, chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And I'm sure Haman's just thinking, like, this is just going to be another banquet. No big deal. Let me go ahead and celebrate after I had to go do this horrendous thing by parading Mordecai around the town and promoting him. Okay. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, so this is just the very next day, the king again asked Queen Esther, "What is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would not have kept quiet, or I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." So even if she was going to be, her and her people were going to be sold into slavery, she's saying, I wouldn't have bothered you for that. But this is more important because they want to kill our people. And I'm sure at this point, the king's thinking, what is she talking about? Because he didn't realize that she was Jewish at this time. So he's probably a little bit perplexed. So King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" I'm sure Haman is shaking in his boots at this moment. Esther said, "An advisory and an enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Ooh, I would be too. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Such a coward, right? He goes out and does this decree, which is behind their backs. He does this because he hates one Jewish guy. Well, their two clans have had a feud for a long time, but what a coward after all he had done. Okay, verse 8. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. Gets better. It just keeps getting better. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So they is the servants of the king. Then one of the attending the king said, "A pole reaching to the height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." So I love how the servants know everything that's going on behind the scenes, and they tell the king exactly what's been going on. The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. So what a turn of events. So the exact same gallows or poles that Haman had set up for Mordecai, he gets hanged on. This all happened in within a 24-hour period. So this is pretty amazing. Okay, chapter 8, the king's edict in behalf of the Jews. So that same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. So not only did Haman get killed, the if you remember back on part 1, when Haman said to the king, if we go ahead and kill all these people, we'll take their plunder and we'll give that to you. So it's almost like a reverse. It says in the Bible that the wealth of the sinners stored up for the righteous. So this is exactly what happened, is that the wealth of Haman got delivered back to Mordecai. And Mordecai didn't even have to do anything. So, well, he had to fast and pray, and he had to go to God and say, help my people. And he had to go to Esther and have her, go in front of the king and speak boldly in front of him. But I'm sure Mordecai wasn't expecting all this, just like he probably wasn't expected to get put on a horse and paraded around town with the king's robe on, the day before. So, okay, verse 3. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended his gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. So remember, the decree that Haman had put out was still in force because the king can't undo an edict that he has put out. So let's see. Okay. And verse 5. It pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it right to do if it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if it pleases him, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on all my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? So at this point, Esther and Mordecai were safe. They weren't going to get killed, but she knew that her people needed rescuing. So she pleaded with the king to go ahead and do that. So King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai, the Jew, "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the poles he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you." So he's telling Mordecai this. "And seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked." So the thing that Haman wrote is still in law, so people can still come and attack the Jews and plunder them. Okay, verse 9. At once the royal secretaries were summoned on the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan. This would have been June 25th, 174 BC, which was 2 months and 10 days after Haman had written his original decree. Okay, so verse 9. At once the royal secretaries were summoned on the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan. They wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. And Kush is the upper Nile region. So you think about like Egypt. So from India to Egypt, that's a big, big area. These orders were written in the script for each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. So there was lots of different languages back then after the whole Tower of Babel. Okay, verse 10. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. I love that. They didn't waste any time. They went out right away and did this. Verse 11, the king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and to protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of the enemies. So that was the edict that Haman had set out. So now the king is saying you can protect yourselves. Verse 12, the day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, which would have been, I believe that was March. No, that was, yeah, I'm sorry. So that would have been March 7th, 473, so a full year later of the original edict. Verse 13, a copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as the law in every province and made known to the people in every nationality, so that the Jews will be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers riding the royal horses went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. So that's where the king presided. Verse 15, when Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. A turn of events in 24 hours, right? And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews, it was time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city to which the edicts of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. So they realized that the Jews were very powerful, that God was protecting them, that God was releasing them, and he set the captives free. And so a lot of people decided to follow God, the one true God. Okay, chapter 9. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. I'm sorry. So this would have been March 7th, 473. So a whole year later from when Haman put out the original edict. So, I mean, you think about that, a whole year, these people are waiting for, before this edict had come out, 2 months after Haman's, but you think about those first couple of months, these people are probably terrified about what's going to happen in a year. Think about if you were in that position, like, okay, in a year, someone's going to come and they can kill you, they can take your house, they can take all your possessions. I'm sure you're kind of thinking like, okay, what am I going to do? You're starting to plan like what's going to happen in a year and what you're going to do. And I'm sure, praying to God too and saying, what is it that you want us to do? That's why they fasted for 3 days as well. So pretty scary to think about. Okay, so on the 13th day of the 12th, and also that the edict of Haman was still out, so they knew that people would still come and attack them, but now they had the right to protect themselves and to fight against them. Okay, on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nations were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king King's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. As Mordecai was prominent in the palace, his reputation spread throughout the province, and he became more and more powerful. So, excuse me. Yeah, because he also did what was right. So they probably knew that they couldn't be deceitful because Mordecai would, bring the truth out. Okay, verse 5. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated him. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Parshandatha, Delphin, Aspatha, Paratha, Adelia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Orisai, Oridai, and Vizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews, because they were the Amalekites. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. It doesn't say why they didn't lay their hands on the plunder, but maybe God told them not to. I'm not sure why, if maybe they had idols, that, they were worshiping other idols and they didn't, want to have that, or if it was the symbolism. We don't know. I find that interesting. Okay, and in verse 11, the number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. So this is all in one day. Verse 12, the king said to Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? It will be granted. The king really liked Esther. 13. If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on the poles. Okay, so the 10 sons are already dead. But what this was, so Haman was still on the pole, and they went ahead and put the 10 sons on the pole, and this was basically like you want to do something to us, look what's going to happen to you. It was definitely a statement to the people to see all of them on the poles, as well as, they're taking out the root of Haman and the Amalekites. So that was a big sign to the people. Okay, so the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar. This would have been, oh gosh. I had that written down before. It's March 15th. I apologize for that. Is it March 14th? Yes, sorry, it's March 14th. And they asked to do this the second day on the 15th. Okay, let's see. Where was I? The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, which would be around March 14th, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Again, they didn't take the plunder. 16. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. In one day, they killed 75,000 people, plus the 500 and the 300 from before. It's a lot of people. That many people were attacking the Jews, so that's pretty crazy. Okay, 17. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it the day of feasting. Okay, so it was the 13th and the 14th. Verse 18. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. That is why the rural Jews, those living in the villages, observed the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day of forgiving presents to one another. So even to this day, the Jews celebrate Purim on the 14th, except in Jerusalem, and they celebrate it on the 15th. And it depends on the calendar, the Hebrew calendar. So it usually falls between February and March. So it's either the 14th or the 15th on the Hebrew calendar. Kind of interesting. Okay, Purim established. Verse 20. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th day of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy, and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. I love this. If you go through the Old Testament, there's so many celebrations. God has like feasts for like a week or a month or a day. So I love that God loves to celebrate. And so I celebrate too. So it's not a bad thing to celebrate and to give each other gifts and to have celebrations for one another. So I love that. Okay. Verse 23. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun doing what Mordecai had written to them. 24. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast out the pur. That is the lot. So remember, it's when they cast lots, it's like throwing dice and then it tells them different dates and things like that. So they had cast the pur for their ruin and destruction. But the plot came to the king's sorry, excuse me. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his son should be impaled on poles. Therefore, these days were called Purim for the word pur, because of everything written in this letter and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them. The Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. And I love over probably 4,000 years. Well, I don't know the math, but anyway, over 3,000 years ago, they're still celebrating, which I love. Okay. Verse 29. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai, the Jews, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. So I just love that. This also, you think about this, it's like this also would have deterred other people from attacking the Jews because they saw how God worked through them and God rescued them. And I love that all of this is done in one 24-hour period because in the beginning of it, all the Jews were going to be killed. And then within 24 hours, the decrees were issued. And then, of course, on the day of the original decree, they annihilated their enemies, the Amalekites, which is amazing. So I think so. That just says if you're in a bad situation right now, you pray to God and you focus, you listen to him, you get in his word and you ask him, what is it that you want me to do, Lord? And he will show you. And all he needs is one day. One day he can change it all. So I just love that. There's other places in scripture too where it says that, all I need is a day. Look at the Red Sea. Look at the Israelites and how they were released in one day and freed in one day. That's pretty awesome. Okay. In chapter 10, the greatness of Mordecai. King Xerxes imposed tribute through the empire to its distant shores. In all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? So they're not only written in the Bible, but they're also written in other areas. So to confirm that this had taken place. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes. So he replaced Haman. Preeminent among the Jews and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. So always do good, always do the right thing, even if it's hard in the moment, it might seem difficult to do the right thing or to stand up and say the right thing, but in the end, you will always be rewarded for doing that. So Anyway, I love the book of Esther. I hope this has been encouraging to you and, maybe you learned something that you didn't know before. So, anyway, share with anybody that you think that this would be helpful for. Please like, subscribe, and post a comment down below. And blessings to you. And may the Lord bless you. And you have a great week. And we will see you next time.